And now, sort of in the interest of time, we would just take one more speaker who would need to leave for another meeting, and I would just ask ILO's Chief Technical Advisor for Inclusive Education and Jobs at the ILO in Kenya to join and just give us her presentation. And this is Miss Caroline Njuki. And her experience spans, development and implementation of migration and displacement policies in East and the Horn of Africa. She previously worked for the IGAD Regional Secretariat on Forced Displacement and Mixed Migration. And she's also a co-founder of a do tank called the Africa Center on Displacement and Migration. She's a non-commentator on African mobility dynamics, and she has also spoken at high-level fora. And I would just like to ask her to give us a bit of her insights, even though that goes into our next session, but I think that there will be quite some interesting questions that could be covered by others who would remain with us. So Ms. Caroline Njuki, if you could just join us.
Thank you, Paddy, and good morning for some, maybe good afternoon and good evening. Really pleased to be able to join this conversation, and sorry that I have to run. So let me make my submission in a few minutes. I would like one of the questions that was posed to the panel that will come after this is also on what the multilateral institutions are doing to support governments. And I would give a broader overview. One is that from the ILO perspective, we have been generating a lot of data, especially on the impact of COVID on the labor sector, specifically on employment, on enterprises. And the speakers before me have all very eloquently spoken to some of those issues. And this is so that as governments the world over really plan their responses, then they can do that from an informed point of view. And just over ILO released what is being called the COVID monitor, that is also trying to look at specific categories or sectors. And the last one was on the impact of COVID-19 on young people. And just a key highlight, of course, is that we've had lockdown measures that are affecting education, training, but also very importantly, transition to the world of work for so many young people who are not able to complete school, are not able to get into the next level of training, go to university, and those who are at the tail end of their schooling, then they're not able to get into apprenticeships, internships, and actually start making an income. So that is one very specific response from the ILO. And the other issue for the ILO, of course, being a tripartite organization, is that we are found on very strong tripartite values, and social dialogue is how we address various aspects in the world of work. And so, of course, enterprises, businesses are under so much pressure. They have lost income. They're struggling to pay, loans and credits, and they're also not able to sustain incomes. And many of them are having to let go of employees or just cut down on the number of working hours, etc. And so, ensuring that social dialogue is continued with between the employers, the workers, and the governments to look at the best scenarios for businesses, for the workers, but also for and facilitated by government. So that has been very, very key. And this is something that straddles into migration as well. Oftentimes, unfortunately, migrants do not join trade unions in more than half of the world. They're not allowed to form or join trade unions. And so looking at how they could also be protected and cushioned via social dialogue is very key. Then broadly within the United Nations as well, the Secretary General has issued a framework. It's called the Socio-Economic Response Framework that is going to guide countries, member states of the United Nations in what we are calling building back better. And that is focused on, of course, health is at the heart of it. It's a priority. I mean, when people are not healthy, we're not able to do so much else. But also macro policies, macro fiscal policies, which includes, restructuring of debt, etc. Support to businesses, support to people, for instance, through social protection. And very importantly is the aspect of social cohesion, because with the loss of jobs, with so many families struggling, that we will have to think about how migrant labor is actually being perceived in so many of these countries that are now struggling with their own, impact, economic impact on various sectors of life. And so looking at how there can be social cohesion between host communities and migrants is also very, very key. Allow me, Paddy, in really 2 to 3 minutes to just highlight briefly some of the issues that are affecting. I'll speak now on labor mobility. If you look at the sectors that have been identified to have been most impacted on by COVID-19, we're looking at the retail sector, we're looking at manufacturing, at accommodation, and these are also the sectors where most labor migrants actually find themselves. And so the shutdown of businesses has meant loss of jobs, loss of incomes for these migrants, and not just for themselves. We're talking about transnationalism. Diasporas send a lot of remittances back home, and the World Bank has had different forecast on what the impact of that is, but we definitely know that we will see a reduction in remittances as a consequence of the economic downturn that the world is experiencing. The other element that is quite a challenge, is being out of employment as a labor migrant in a foreign country with no income replacement. Most migrants do not have social protection. They're not covered by social protection. And those who are in businesses are also not covered by some of the relief measures that governments are announcing, especially in Africa, really. Of course, we have exceptions, for instance, in South Africa, and the colleague from South Africa spoke to that. But really, for most countries, things are really tight, and their first focus is, their own citizenry. They're still thinking elections and how even COVID-19 will impact on elections going forward. And that has meant that this has made life so much more difficult for migrants who are not covered by any form of, income replacement. They don't have any employment protection. Not to talk about health insurance, which people around the world need so much right now. We all know that it just takes a single hospital bill for so many people, especially in Africa, to slip into poverty. And then if you look at the difficulties around upholding some of the safety social distancing protocols that have been passed on by the WHO and governments. And this often is not so easy. If you look at areas where migrants live, most of them live in in congested areas, in informal housing, very similar to really the slum, in slum-like conditions. And even when they have sort of they're not in a slum, you will find that they live together in joint accommodation. And so trying to social distance in that kind of environment is quite difficult, apart from not having proper sanitation measures. And finally is, what this really is speaking to us about, and we hope that as we build back better, there are key aspects that we are going to be looking at. One is on, the importance of including everyone when we are talking about, decent jobs. tackling informality that takes a lot of protection measures from jobs, thinking about social protection, how is it that we are able to integrate these sections of society, but also when we are thinking about urban inclusion, do we have the labor migrants who live in some of these urban areas in mind, and how do we ensure that even they can benefit from from meaningful, public services, as it were. Regionally, there have been some efforts in the Horn of Africa, and the speaker from Ethiopia mentioned some of those. We have seen, for instance, the Regional Economic Community, IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, come up with a regional framework that would allow sharing of healthcare workers, sharing of other, medical items, if I may use that term loosely, just to ensure that there is a bit of equity, but also those that are not able to support themselves, countries in conflict, for instance, Somalia, are not left behind in the fight against the pandemic. And I would like to stop there, but also mention that Africa so far is doing well. Of course, we understand that there is the challenge of testing, but this is not only an Africa only challenge. I don't think anyone in the world is able to test enough. There are some few elements that we think are favoring us, and the first speaker spoke to this, but I hope that in building back some of the innovation that we have seen around the continent, a continent that could not produce masks but relied on imports from other countries, swung into action. We've seen innovation around, making sanitizers that were not there in the continent, as basic as they are, making ventilators, but also looking at how to support those that have lost jobs. And we hope that this is the kind of innovation that Africa is going to build on, but also, most importantly, engage her bilateral and multilateral partners on. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm really sorry that I cannot stay longer. Thank you.
Caroline, thank you so much for joining us, and I think we will be forwarding quite a number of questions to you, even as you are heading out. I think some very good insights there that just speaks into international cooperation and also understanding what the UN frameworks are like, and also your elaboration of the building better. And those key points, on how we move forward. I think they're very insightful. And again, thank you very much for joining us.